Joining me right now is Lord Darroch. Kim Darroch is the former British ambassador to the United States. He's also former national security advisor under David Cameron when he was Prime Minister. Kim Darroch, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Julia.
Thank you very much indeed. What did you make of what David Cameron had to say there, talking about being worried about this? Are you of the belief that Israel is breaking international law?
I had a lot of sympathy actually for David Cameron answering that very difficult question, because I mean, I spent 40 odd years in the Foreign Office. You rely on the Foreign Office lawyers to tell you whether international law has been broken or not. Much more often than not, it really isn't clear cut. And what they will tell you sometimes is, well, maybe, but actually you need to know a lot more detail about what has happened before we can make a definitive judgment. And I think that's what David Cameron was reflecting there. So I can understand why he took such what sounded like a somewhat evasive line about this.
And as always in war as well, you don't necessarily get the full picture. We haven't got largely independent journalists in Gaza.
That's exactly the point. Julia, is exactly the point I was going to make.
Apologies.
We're not going to know the detail because there aren't journalists absolutely on the front line with the Israeli troops as they prosecute this ground operation. So this is all going to be, maybes rather than definites, I fear.
Yeah, and these things take a lot of time, don't they? Of course, there is an awful lot of pressure on the Israelis to cut those casualties, particularly of Palestinian civilian children as well. I mean, and that's a concern for any right-minded person. I'm always amazed. I get accused of, goodness knows, everything these days. But the idea that people aren't concerned about, innocent people, particularly children, being killed in war, it frankly is an abomination. Reality is, for a lot of people, though, arguing that Israel's right of self-defense is, how do you conduct war against Hamas terrorists? 8,000 they claim they've killed of their fighters. There are another, 22,000 to go on that basis. It's estimated they've got 30,000 in Hamas who are fighters. I mean, how do you conduct that war in such a small strip of land without, unfortunately, horribly, tragically killing innocent civilians as well?
This is, if I may say so, exactly the point. There are two conflicting principles here, both enshrined in international law. One is the right of self-defense, and that attack on the 7th of October was unprovoked and brutal and killed the greatest number of Israelis in a single day in the history of Israel. The Israelis are now conducting their ground operation. They have every right to try to destroy Hamas, to destroy Hamas's leadership, destroy its capacity to fight. But this is one of the most densely populated pieces of real estate on the planet. And it's very, very difficult to do it, even with the most extreme precautions, without civilian casualties. Now, both Tony Blinken and, to an extent, David Cameron have been critical of how the Israelis have done the operation, have said they could have taken greater care to avoid civilian casualties. I'm sure that's right, and that's public criticism from two of Israel's strongest allies. So the Israelis could have done more. But in any circumstances, I'm afraid it's a terrible thing to say, but some civilian casualties were inevitable.
Well, indeed, and it's happened in every war and will continue to happen. What did you make also when he was asked about the British hostages still believed to be being held by Hamas in Gaza, probably in tunnels somewhere? Some 130 hostages are still thought to be being held by Hamas, 2 of them British. He said, when asked, he said, I just don't want to say any more. We don't have any information to share with you. That doesn't mean doesn't have information. You worked at the Foreign Office, you say, in a very senior capacity for many years. What efforts will there be to try and locate these people, to try and get them out? What's going on behind the scenes, do you believe?
But I'm sure there will be a lot of contact with the American government, with other European governments that may have hostages there, and with the Israelis about the ground operation, its likely duration, and how they are reconciling what they're doing in destroying Hamas, destroying the tunnels, with the need to try, if at all possible, to rescue the hostages. I'm not surprised David Cameron couldn't say anything about that publicly. This will all be done in very, very secure conditions with other governments. And you have to worry about the position for hostages because, again, this is another thing that is difficult to reconcile. A ground operation to destroy Hamas, to destroy their tunnels, to destroy their infrastructure, and the need to try and rescue the hostages safe and sound, if that's possible. It's a very difficult thing to pull off.
Well, indeed. And I'm absolutely amazed, actually, by how much people are happy to forget about what happened on October 7th, the fact the hostages are still being held. And given the testimony we've had about what happened on the day on October 7th, but also has happened to the hostages who've been released, that information now coming about the horrific treatment they've had, the fears that people must have, the fact that 2 of our British nationals are being held, you know, people seem to be shrugging. I'd love to see the marches on the streets for those people rather than, you know, as well as, you know, if people want to march, obviously, understandably, for Palestinian civilians, that makes sense as well. But I mean, these are also, you know, Israeli civilians and British civilians and other national civilians as well. Let me also ask you about another element of this sort of wider Middle Eastern sort of concern, which is the Houthi rebels and their attacks on shipping in the Red Sea. We had an announcement today from the Defence Secretary Grant Shapps, the largest Houthi attack to date, this coming just days after Western allies united and saying, look, basically, stop it or we'll take action. But a British warship, the HMS Diamond, a Type 45 destroyer, which was deployed by the UK to help protect shipping in the region, shot down 7 drones launched by the Iranian-backed Houthi fighters in the Red Sea. They say, along with US forces, it was the largest operation to repel the largest drone and missile attack to date. How concerned are you about this all escalating?
Julia, throughout this conflict, ever since 7th of October, one of the big fears has been about escalation. And it's more or less been kept under control until now. But you have to be worried about the increasing and more intense clashes in southern Lebanon between the Israeli forces and Hezbollah, between the rising tension in the West Bank, tension between the settlers and the Palestinians living there, more IDF operations, and most of all, now about these Houthi attacks on civilian shipping going through the Red Sea. Now, hats off to the British and American forces who were so efficient in shooting down these drones yesterday. Just shows how accurate their weaponry is. But there's a capacity and a possibility for this to continue indefinitely. And there will certainly be pressure, if it does, on both American and British forces to actually do something against Houthi bases in Yemen. So that's another potential risk of escalation. Plus, there will be economic consequences to all the shipping that is now going around the Cape of Good Hope, the long route, rather than through the Red Sea because of these dangers. And that's going to have consequences, I'm afraid, for prices in the shops.
Indeed. I think we've learned in the recent years just how interconnected the world's economy is. Lord Darroch, great to talk to you. Thank you so much for joining us. He's the former UK ambassador to the US and former National Security Advisor under David Cameron's.
Thank you.